Hey there folks, Aldershot here, and today we're going to do an impression on the Beginner's Guide developed by Everything Unlimited, or more precisely by Davey Wreden, who is the original developer of the Stanley Parable, a game that I really love, and certainly one of the reasons why the Beginner's Guide caught my attention. Just so you guys know, this video will be formatted a little bit differently. This commentary is actually pre-recorded, in which we will use game footage in the background to give you guys an idea of how the game's going to be played. And the reason we're doing this instead of our usual live commentary fashion is because the Beginner's Guide is extremely narrative focused, right? To the point where even the quiet times or the silences between events have a fairly significant impact on the overall experience, and I don't feel like I can give you an honest impression into this game without letting you guys experiencing it naked, on its own, without any commentary, right? It's just one of those kind of games. So what we're going to do is we're going to commentate over some pre-recorded footage, and at the end of the video I'll show you the first 10 minutes of this game naked, without interruptions, without any commentary, so you guys can get a truly honest feeling of how this game is going to be played and if it's well suited to you, right? That's really the end goal, if you will. But the footage that we'll have in the background will basically continue after the first 10 minutes, in which we'll show you at the end of the video. So it's going to be a little bit chopped up. I just want to let you guys know that's how this video is going to be put together. Anyways, let's just jump into the game. Alright, the Beginner's Guide. Well, this is definitely a very interesting game. In fact, calling this a game might be itself a little controversial to some gamers, if you will, in that there's no lose states in this game whatsoever. You can't die, you can't fail at all in this game. The only way I can think of as far as failing in the Beginner's Guide is not moving forward at all, in which that itself isn't even really a fail state, because the game doesn't restart or end in any fashion. You just kind of sit there in limbo. But yeah, there's no fail state in this quote-unquote game. It is what a lot of people would call a walking simulator, but that is something you would expect from the developers of the Stanley Parable, and something else you would come to expect from Mr. Davey Wreden himself is that the story is very odd, and the Beginner's Guide certainly is extremely story focused, right? I'm not going to go into any specific details about the story. I'm going to try to avoid as much spoilers as possible, but some of it will have to be kind of mentioned, obviously, because we're talking about the game. But anyways, it's essentially the story of his developer friend and why he stopped making games, right? Without going into any specific details, it does get a little bit weird, and it does take a bit of a turn around the end of the game. I guess it's something that you would expect, right? And like I mentioned, this is extremely story focused, and it's almost like when you're playing the Beginner's Guide, it almost feels more like a tour through Davey's, I don't know, history with his friend, right? And it feels a lot less like a game in that sense. It's almost like an interactive museum tour, if you will. As strange as that sounds, but that's kind of how I feel about it. It's actually less gamey than, say, the Stanley Parable. And we'll go more into that in just a little bit. But do keep in mind, the Beginner's Guide is only an hour and a half. It mentions it in the description itself. And after playing it myself, I actually did finish, credits rolling and all, at 91 minutes into the game. So it is extremely accurate when it says it lasts for about an hour and a half, because it really does. Now, I'm going to go into some of the differences between the beginner's guide and the Stanley Parable, because I'm going to be drawing a lot of comparisons to the Stanley Parable, just so you guys know, because as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm a huge Stanley Parable fan. It's one of the reasons why I had such a huge interest in the beginner's guide and why I wanted to play so much. But one thing that's really different about the beginner's guide is that, well, it is an hour-and-a-half journey, unlike the Stanley Parable, where it's more like a collection of 5 to 10 minute little gameplay segments where the player will either restart or die, in which he'll have to restart to gain the full story, essentially replaying the same parts in different ways every time you do. In the beginner's guide, it's really about this one journey. Now, I'm sure there's lots of Easter eggs scattered throughout the game as well, and there are choices to be made. However, I don't know how significant these choices actually impact the game. I'm guessing it doesn't, but I haven't really done significant research into the game, as it's quite new still, right? And like I said, there's probably Easter eggs scattered around. However, because the game's length is actually an hour-and-a-half, rather than just a couple minute segments, threaded together, it does make kind of hunting for these Easter eggs and discovering these little secrets and intricacies in the game itself a little bit less enjoyable, for lack of a better word, than when I did it in the Stanley Parable. Mainly because in the Stanley Parable, when I finished one little tiny playthrough where, let's say, I pushed the wrong button and I died, I had to start over because the narrator said so for some reason. Well, I have an opportunity to walk through some of the same segments of the game to try and find new things about that same segment along the way. Whereas the beginner's guide is really about point A to point B, one single journey rather than multiple journeys threaded together. You really are only presented one opportunity to find those Easter eggs. So for those who enjoyed the Easter egg hunts in the Stanley Parable, although I'm sure it's in the beginner's guide as well, it is going to be a little bit more tedious to find those Easter eggs than in the Stanley Parable, right? Now, the beginner's guide, I think, do realize this and address this issue by allowing you to individually select which chapter you want to play. So that way, let's say you read about an Easter egg in chapter 5 or something, then you can just instantly go to chapter 5 and try and find that Easter egg. However, it's still not quite as satisfying as when you were Easter egg hunting in the Stanley Parable. Mainly because, again, because it's the Stanley Parable, the way it's formatted, you are running through the same segments of the game over and over again with little differences, making it interactive and cohesive and all that stuff. The beginner's guide, where it is just one journey from A to B for an hour-and-a-half, playing through middle parts of the story just to find that Easter egg does feel more tedious. Because again, in Stanley Parable, you can do it along the way, right? Now, that's not to say the quality of the narrative in the beginner's guide isn't good, because oh my god, it's by far, its most outstanding elements, by far. The game achieves an incredible story through, well, obviously amazing writing. It is from, like I said, the developer of the Stanley Parable, so pretty talented writer right there, and he got quite a resume. But it's also told through really, really smart environmental design. How the levels progressively get better and better as he tells the story further and further in. Like as though if the developers is getting better as this guided tour is being led to us, right? So it's very, very interesting that way. But it also tells it through really, really smart sound design as well. The music is absolutely amazing in this game. It really, really is. The music might actually be one of the strongest aesthetical points of the beginner's guide, in fact. The visuals itself aren't anything to write home about, and that itself kind of plays into the story where we are playing through the old levels of a retired developer, right? So it makes sense that the visuals aren't overly impressive, but the audio really makes up for it, right? It really, really drives home the emotion, if you will, that the developers want to drive home, and it does it very, very well. Not just through the words that he's speaking, but through the background audio that we're going through as well, which is absolutely fantastic. Now the visuals itself, like I said, isn't anything to write home about for the most part, because again, thematically it makes sense that some of these environments and models are lower quality than others, whereas the story of, again, a retired developer. But that doesn't mean there is not some interesting set designs in this game as well. And there's definitely going to be a few points in the game where you're going to run into it and you're going to just sit there for a little while looking at the scenery, and you're like, wow, this is really, really crazy, right? So the story is absolutely fantastic. It really, really is. It's a great little story about his friend, Nick's developer, and it goes into the relationship, and there's peaks and lows and valleys and all this kind of great narrative building. It's just a great game as far as interactive narratives are concerned. Now the question is this a game at all? Well, this game, the Beginner's Guide, is actually less gamey than the Stanley Parable, if you can believe that. The Stanley Parable itself already is very much a walking simulator, quote unquote, but there is something you could call a fail state in the Stanley Parable. There is kind of like, excuse me, there is some kind of incentive for the player to collect things, and you know, it's basically the Easter egg hunting, right? And finding all the endings and all that kind of stuff. Whereas the Beginner's Guide doesn't even really have that. It doesn't even have that aspect of collecting things, right? It doesn't have a fail state. There are choices, but I have no idea if the choices have any impact on the game whatsoever. It's just everything that game shouldn't be, but is, if that makes any sense. This I would attribute more to film than a video game, I want to say. Even more so than the Stanley Parable. Even more so than a lot of walking simulators, to be completely honest. A lot of walking simulators I play, they have some form of puzzle along the way, where the player have to go either point A to point B, or go through a labyrinth or something like that. Whereas this one doesn't even have that. It's really, really much a guided tour through and through. The only true interactivity you have with the environment is essentially looking around or how fast you move forward, right? Which isn't really much gameplay. As far as gameplay wise, there's really not much at all. Not even simple button pushes. Well, there is one puzzle, but that puzzle is very significant to the story, and I won't go into any more about that. But outside of that one puzzle, there is absolutely no gameplay other than holding the W key forward. That's essentially the game, right? So if you're interested in the Beginner's Guide, be interested in it for the right reasons. Know that it is extremely narrative focused, okay? Know that you're going into a very strange but very uniquely told story, and a story, again, that I don't think could be told through any other medium other than video games. While ironically, this video game is one of the least video games I've ever played. If that makes any sense at all. It's very, very strange, guys, is what I'm trying to say. But I think it's a very worthwhile experience. It's very fourth wall breaking. It's very involving too. You as the player, as an audience member, is also immersed into the story as well. I'm not going to go into how, but you're an element of the story. As much as the narrator, as much as the character that the narrator is talking about. And that is something else that's very, very interesting about this, the way the story is told. So overall, obviously I like the Beginner's Guide. I think you guys can tell. But as an overall experience, I do feel like the Stanley Parable was stronger than the Beginner's Guide, mainly because there was so many different ways to play it with so many different outcomes. There was mechanics, right? Really weird mechanics, but they are still kind of gamey mechanics, you know, like the whole collecting thing, right? Collecting all the endings, collecting all the Easter eggs. And the way the Stanley Parable was presented through little small segments that strung together into a cohesive story made it easier to really feel and really get a hold of the entirety of what the game has to present, as in finding Easter eggs and all the ending, right? It made it a lot easier, a lot more user-friendly to do that. And I also feel like there was more outrageous moments in the Stanley Parable than the Beginner's Guide. The Beginner's Guide, the way the story is told, even though it's very, very different through the form of video games, but the way it arcs and all that kind of stuff, right? It's very traditional, so it's a lot more like a movie, like I said, but a very, very, very interactive movie. But yeah, that's basically the Beginner's Guide. I like it, I really do. A little bit weaker than the Stanley Parable, admittedly, but still, under its own merit, absolutely a fantastic, fantastic story. And anyone who enjoys a great storytelling owes it to themselves to play the Beginner's Guide. However, if you're looking for a game with mechanics, right? I'm afraid you are probably going to be disappointed by this one. There is no mechanics here, guys. There's not even a death state. There's not even an end game, really, except getting to the end, right? But there you go. That's basically the Beginner's Guide. Yeah, definitely very, very interesting. Very strange, if nothing else. Now, at the end of this video, as in right now, at the end of this commentated part, I'm going to show you 10 minutes of just the game, the first 10 minutes of it, so you guys have a honest feel for what the game has to offer. Anyways, folks, thanks for listening. Always appreciate it, of course. And if you enjoy this, you know, show me some love, like, share, fave, and comment. And you haven't already subscribed, I'll bring you lots more video games just like this. Thanks for watching, everyone. All the shoutouts.
Hi there. Thank you very much for playing The Beginner's Guide. My name is Davey Wreden. I wrote The Stanley Parable, and while that game tells a pretty absurd story, today I'm going to tell you about a series of events that happened between 2008 and 2011. We're going to look at the games made by a friend of mine named Coda. Now, these games mean a lot to me. I met Coda in early 2009 at a time when I was really struggling with some personal stuff, and his work pointed me in a very powerful direction. I found it to be a good reference point for the kinds of creative works that I wanted to make. So just to start you off, this is, I think, the first game he ever made. It's a level for Counter-Strike. You can walk around here, by the way. And mostly it's just Coda learning the basics of building a 3D environment. But what I like is that even though he starts from the simple aesthetic of a desert town, he then scatters these colorful abstract blobs and impossible floating crates around the level. And of course, it destroys the illusion that this actually is a desert town, and instead this level becomes a kind of calling card from its creator. It's like a reminder that this video game was constructed by a real person. And it kind of makes you wonder, what was going through his head as he was building this? This is what I like about all of Coda's games. I mean, not that they're all fascinating as games, but that they are all going to give us access to their creator. I want us to see past the games themselves. I want to get to know who this human being really is. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. So, it's 2008, Coda starts making these games, and he never releases any of them. He doesn't put them onto the internet, he just makes them and then immediately abandons them, and they sit on his computer forever. And I think he really understood this image of himself as a recluse. At one point, he jokingly renamed his computer's recycling bin to Important Games Folder. So, you know, this was just how he worked. He tended to crank them out one after the other without even really pausing to try to understand what he had just made, until suddenly one day, he just stopped. In 2011, that was it. He made his last game, and then he hasn't made another one since. And that's why I've taken this opportunity to gather all of his work together. is because I find his games powerful and interesting, and I'd like this collection to reach him, to maybe encourage him to start creating again. And if the people like you who play this also happen to find his work interesting, then I'm sure it'll just send that much stronger of a message of encouragement to Coda. So thanks for joining me on this. If you have a particular interpretation that I haven't mentioned here, or if you just need to get in touch, you can email me at daveyWreden@gmail.com. Okay, that's about it for introduction. Let's take a look at Coda's first proper game. As each game is loading, I'll show you the date that it was completed. This first one was made in November 2008.
Warning. Whisper machine active. Shift destruction imminent.
This game is called Escape from Whisper, and it's one of the more generic games you'll see from Coda.
Security call breached. Hostile alien life forms inbound.
It kinda looks like this game was abandoned mid-development. For instance, you have this gun, which you'd think would indicate that there are supposed to be monsters or enemies somewhere, but then clearly there are no enemies anywhere. You can't even reload the gun when you run out of bullets. But ultimately we don't really know. Maybe Coda thought that actually it was complete the way that it is. And I think that we should talk about his games for what they are, rather than for what they're not.
Enemy force neutralized. Begin ship evacuation.
I love how you can see the bottom of the universe from this room. Apparently this space station has a labyrinth on it. Sure, I don't know. There's really no reason for it that I've ever been able to discern, so in the interest of time, I'm just gonna skip you on past it. Okay, this is the part that's interesting. The game has this narrative about the Whisper machine and how it has to be turned off, and then you get to the engine room.
Hey, you there, in the engine room. You could save us all. That beam is powering the Whisper machine. We could disrupt it by introducing a great enough heat signature. If your body could stop the beam. It's so much to ask, but for all of our lives, would you do it? Could you give yourself?
Let me pause here for a second. What you just experienced, stepping into the beam and then dying, is probably what Coda had initially intended when he was developing this level. But when he first compiles and plays it, something goes wrong. There's a bug somewhere. And this is what happens instead. The beam causes you to start floating. And this is an important moment for him. Because yes, this is technically a glitch, but Coda identifies something human about it, like how small it makes you feel in the face of this larger chaotic system. Or this floating could be the afterlife, a peaceful place, juxtaposed against all of the hysteria that you've just had to traverse. I don't even know. I have no idea what he was thinking, but what's clear is that after making this, something lodges itself in his brain. He wants to do more of these really weird and experimental designs. So he stops work on this and moves on to a stream of tiny little games that go in all sorts of directions. Let's go ahead and take a look at the first game he made after leaving this one behind. Yep, in this game you can only walk backwards. So it's a short and relatively minimalist experiment combining motion and narrative. It is less advanced than the previous game, but actually it seems to be more focused, more complete. Code is trying to give it a unique voice rather than simply basing it on a pre-existing trope. It's a short little thought, it says what it wants to say, and then it ends. Didn't need anything more than that. Which to me is why it works, because it gets out quick. Okay, next one. And that's it. Okay, the meaning of this game won't be clear just yet. Please be patient with me for a few more games, and I promise you'll see what makes it interesting. Oftentimes, Coda would put bizarre titles like this one at the start of his games. I wish I'd known him at the time that he was making these early games. He would really only talk to me about his work as he was making it. Once he stopped work on a game, like, that was it. It was dead to him. And I don't agree with that at all, but what are you gonna do? Once you've been slowed to an absolute crawl, the door at the top of the stairs opens. So why, if Coda's not showing these games to anyone, why bother opening the door at all? Well, to show you, I'm modifying the game here so that when you press enter, it'll bring you back up to full speed so you can enter the door for yourself. A room that's warm and nice and filled with little ideas for games. Coda would often tell me that he didn't mind if people thought of him as cold or distant. He said that he knew that he was actually a vibrant and compassionate person, but that it takes time to really see that.